When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
This is Cindy Burnett. Welcome to my award-winning podcast, Thoughts from a Page, a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. On this show, I chat with authors whose books I have enjoyed about their new releases and others in the book world about the books they have loved. With so many books coming out weekly, it can be hard to decide what to read, so I find the best ones and share them with you. In a similar vein, I recently released my 17-page 2025 winter reading guide that highlights 45 recent and upcoming releases, plus new titles in book series, fiction, nonfiction pairings, stellar mystery series, and some anticipated spring and summer releases. All of these will make great reads for this winter and spring. I strive to find those under-the-radar gems. If you're interested, fill out the Google form in the show notes and submit a tip of your choosing. Today, Gillian McAllister returns to chat about famous last words. Gillian can write thrillers unlike almost any other thriller writer. She plot points so well, she takes interesting tropes and subverts them, and she writes such amazing characters. This one is on my winter reading guide, as well as a March Buzz Reads pick. Gillian is the New York Times bestselling author of Reese's Book Club pick, Wrong Place, Wrong Time, and numerous other novels. She graduated with an English degree before working as a lawyer. She lives in Birmingham, England, where she now writes full-time. She is also the creator and co-host of the popular Honest Authors podcast. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
Lowe's knows that free is just better. That's why MyLowe's Rewards is free to join. As a member, you earn points towards MyLowe's money on eligible purchases, get exclusive free gifts, and earn free shipping at Silver Key status, all on top of weekly member-only deals. Don't wait. Join MyLowe's Rewards for free today and start saving more. Lowe's, we help, you save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day, and that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
Welcome back, Gillian. How are you today?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing great as well. I loved Famous Last Words, and I cannot wait to chat about it with you.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk.
So let's start out with you giving a quick synopsis of Famous Last Words for those that haven't read it yet.
So, Famous Last Words tells the story of Cam, who is a new mother and literary agent returning to work after her maternity leave. And she wakes up and her husband isn't there. And she tells herself maybe she's forgotten he had a meeting or a work thing or a trip. And she goes to work as normal. She drops her daughter at daycare. And then when she gets to work, there is a breaking news alert on the television in the foyer of the agency where she works. And it says there's a hostage situation developing in central London. And at this point, she can't get hold of her husband. And she starts to worry he's caught up in it. And within minutes, the police arrive at her work and they tell her he is caught up in it, but he isn't the hostage. He is the gunman.
I always love your books because you take a standard situation and turn it on his head. So instead of him being taken hostage, he's the hostage taker. So clever.
Thank you. I kind of wanted to write I wanted to take a trope from an action thriller, but kind of apply it to more my sort of style of writing, which is that rather than sort of big explosions and detonations, it's actually about a marriage and how committing a crime that makes you notorious would impact your relationship.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to talk about a little later, but we can talk about it right now. Several of your stories deal with being a mother, but also with a marriage and how different outside factors can impact it. What makes you want to pursue those themes?
I think that when you're looking at close relationships that either are familial, like parent and child, or have become familial, so husband and wife is, a long marriage, the love is almost unconditional, I think. I just find it really interesting in terms of stakes and plot, because most people will do anything to preserve those relationships. And I think it's so interesting to sort of ponder the notion that you are married to somebody and you've had a child with them, but you might not know them at all.
That's true. It makes you think about your own relationships as you're reading your books. That's my husband. What don't I know?
Yes, my husband was delighted that the strap line was, "This morning he was your husband, by nightfall he's a criminal." His work colleagues were kind of like, "Have you seen your wife's latest book? Like, who's it based on?"
You're like, not you. It's okay. The other thing you do that I really enjoy is your characters are just normal people. While there are secrets and there are things happening, they're not running around behind each other. They're not awful people. They're not doing things that you're like, why would someone do that? And for me, that's really different for a thriller and good.
Yeah, I do a lot of drafts. I'm sort of almost in my sort of slightly chaotic process of drafting and redrafting my novels has become slightly public recently. And I do try to strive for realism. And one of the reasons that I have so many do-overs is sometimes I have a plot point that kind of works on paper or feels quite clever on paper. But the reality is people simply wouldn't do it. And when I'm writing it, I get this sort of very specific instinctive feeling that I wouldn't do this. And I'm kind of making a character do something to service my plot. And that is when I kind of know I've taken a wrong turn. And I really hope that in all of my novels, most of the plot points are relatable and you might imagine you might do that yourself. Even sometimes the perpetrators.
No, that's a valid point. I just love it because as I read, I'm not thinking, oh gosh, I don't really like this person, or why are they doing all these awful things, or that makes no sense. So let me back up though. You said recently it became public. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, of course. I've been doing some press lately for Just Another Missing Person, first of all, and now Famous Last Words. And my process is that I plan a novel. I am a planner and I plan it quite formally. I get a synopsis signed off by my agents and I write the first draft to that synopsis. But 10 books out of 10 books now, I have then deleted the draft. And I let this slip in an interview recently. And now lots of other people, when they interview me, it's almost the first question they ask is this sort of mad process I have where I basically start each book again. And I do wish that my process were different, but sadly it's not. And this seems to be what I'm stuck with.
Okay, that's hilarious. And I did not see that as I was getting ready for this interview. So I was like, what is she talking about? Well, that's crazy. That must take a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of have a theory that although lots of authors' processes look different, they're kind of the same, but in different orders. So somebody that only writes 500 words a day might tinker and tinker and tinker with those words so that they're only really writing one draft and they're sort of deleting and rewriting daily. Whereas what I tend to do is write an enormous amount of words per day, often like 3,000, and then get to the end of an 80,000 draft and kind of scrap it and start again. But it is actually the same process. It's just kind of I do it in larger chunks, I think. That's my theory anyway, but it might just be that I have a much more dysfunctional process than other people.
No, I don't think that's it. And I actually agree with you. And I say that pretty regularly. When I interview authors, almost every single author has a bit of a different process, the way they approach it. But in the end, it all seems like it takes about the same amount of time. It's just a matter of where you're spending that time. And that's what you're saying.
Yeah, like really, it takes a year or more. Nobody that I know has found a hack where they can do it in 2 months. And the kind of ironic thing is that once I've done several do-overs and I've sorted out my characters and I've had these sort of trial and error runs, I actually do write the final draft in 2 months, but I could never do that from the off. And that's because the process is actually for me, it's the drafting, but I think for everybody, it's actually the thinking. And some people can actually do the thinking actively, whereas for me, I have to repeatedly write it and then see which way sort of feels the best way.
And you've done all that prep work. Even if you delete it, you still have all of that in your head and you know where you're going.
Yes, totally. And a lot of people ask me, does anything stand from draft 1 to 2? But for example, Luke, the husband, narrated famous last words in draft 1. So it's totally different. It often has a different hook. So I do think I'm more of a prolific rewriter than most other people.
Okay, that is so interesting. Because another thing I was going to ask you is how you chose to have Cam and Niall narrate. So talk a little bit about that, having Luke write the first draft and having the two of them write what becomes the final draft.
Well, Camilla always partly narrated and Luke was the other narrator. And the decision I made in that first draft was that it ruined the suspense for Luke to narrate because, and it always seems obvious afterwards, but when you're at the very beginning of writing a book, these questions are just not as clear. And so Luke narrated and it became very clear early on why he was doing what he was doing. And therefore the suspense was tricky. So I swapped him out in the second draft and I switched to the hostage negotiator because I thought, A, that's an interesting job. And B, it's kind of a little bit of a cat and mouse between the two of them because they both want to know what has happened. But Niall, the hostage negotiator, wants to know in order to arrest Luke, whereas Camilla wants to know because she thinks that Luke is actually a good person and won't have done this for anything other than being forced, possibly.
It was a good contrast. How did you come up with the idea for this one?
Well, a lot of my books at the moment take a big trope, like an action thriller kind of hostage situation. And my next one is a kidnap and ransom. And they play with them. And like you say, I like to invert them. And I also like to make them more my own, but also more, I would say, female-centric. Die Hard might have similarities with Famous Last Words, but it doesn't on the page because Famous Last Words is very much about, it's a love story between husband and wife first and foremost. And I think I'm kind of enjoying at the moment to look at kind of what, is popular in the genre and try and put my own spin on it.
And I'm assuming you had to do a lot of research for this one.
Yes, I went on a hostage negotiation course, which was very interesting and strange and enlightening. So yeah, a phenomenal amount of research because some things you can find out through just a few emails and Googling and a couple of phone calls maybe, but hostage negotiation is actually so niche. After I had spoken to the hostage negotiator for several hours already, I thought I actually just need to go on this course and kind of do it for myself, which, as I said, was very useful for my plot, but also quite useful actually for various other elements of just being a human, like listening to people. And I must say, it does help me parent as well, which you can make of that what you will.
I was just thinking that I would bet it would help you parent. So what does a hostage negotiator class involve? Well,
it was, first of all, the theory of the FBI and the British Met Police use the same 6-step procedure for negotiating. And they, all 5 of the first steps involve listening. And so the theory really is accepting the notion that in order to persuade somebody, you can't skip the listening and the empathy. And most people have a desire to be listened to and understood, especially those in high stress situation where they might have done something they regret. And the final step is, it comprises quite a lot of different techniques, really, but the main ones are reciting back their emotions to them in order to validate them. There's something called priming when you use quite specific language, such as when you come out of the warehouse where you're holding hostages, you can use the back door. And using that kind of declarative language kind of primes people to do that. So it's things like that. And it's very interesting to kind of use things like that in your day-to-day life. And actually, you do notice that people sort of are susceptible to those techniques.
That is fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people regard it as kind of, if you say, I use hostage techniques, people think you mean like, you know, you wear riot gear or something. But actually, I use it in parenting because the main thing is empathy. And I think, I have a 2-year-old and I think he can't tell the time. I don't think he knows that his nap is his nap and not his overnight sleep. So he doesn't often know what's coming next. And actually, if you prime somebody, i.e., for an hour before you want them to do something, you talk a lot about it, they are more likely to do it because they feel more in control of their life, which is not really a technique as such as just actually understanding human nature, I think.
And the listening aspects as well.
Exactly. Quite often, my son has very valid reasons for not wanting to do things. And I think a lot of parents kind of get into a trap where they kind of feel like they need to be in charge and you can't negotiate with a toddler. But actually, I found anyway that if I give an inch, my son doesn't take a mile, actually. He just gives an inch too, and everybody gets on like a lot better. So I do recommend it for that.
And I always found that my kids just sometimes wanted me to listen to what they were telling me, and that often parents want to kind of skip through that and move along to the next step. But if I would just sit there and listen to the story or whatever it was they were telling me, things would go a lot smoother.
Yeah, I think parenting can be quite task-based. There's always a meal to be had or somewhere to go and you've got to get your shoes on. But I actually think if you spend 10 minutes priming them, but also listening to what they want to do, there's a kind of concept in hostage negotiation called reciprocity, where I do something for you and then you'll do something for me. And actually, if I say to my son, we've got 15 minutes before we go out, what do you want to do? We can do anything. So far, he has never suggested something that I've said no to because he's 2 and he's not going to say, let's jump off the house or whatever. And actually, then during that activity, I talk to him about where we're going next. And the transition just goes so smoothly because I think they feel heard and seen as much as anything else.
So you need to launch a whole new parenting class that uses all these hostage negotiation tactics.
I'm scared to say because he doesn't yet tantrum and possibly he'll just start and I'll have to eat my words. But so far, so good. So maybe.
Well, how did you decide to make Camilla a literary agent?
Well, I have been observing for a while the trend for books written and set in the publishing industry. And I've always found it really interesting because obviously authors are sort of on the outside looking in to that. But I didn't want to do it just for the sake of doing it. And then it occurs to me, Camilla is a literary agent, but she's also her husband's literary agent, who is a writer. And that makes the note he leaves her, the eponymous famous last words, so much more loaded because she perceives that he is writing something loaded that only she can understand. And it's fairly cryptic, the note he leaves. So I really wanted to kind of feed the publishing element directly into the plot.
And she obviously loves to read because she couldn't be a literary agent and not. But I love that she turns to books sometimes when she needs a break or that's kind of her way of calming herself down.
Yeah, she does. She's naturally introverted and therefore not particularly equipped, I would say, to chase down such an active and dark investigation. But what she does have from kind of regularly escaping into fiction is this narrative sense. And what really drives her is the sort of search for her own narrative ending.
I liked that. What surprised you the most when you were writing this one?
That's a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that about any of my books. What surprised me was how difficult it was to have the entire book be about Luke, but Luke not be on the page because you don't hear from him. And I don't want to spoil anything, but at 30%-ish through the novel, it kind of kicks up into a new gear where it's even harder to hear from him. And it was quite difficult to show what he has been doing and why without that being a big exposition dump at the end. It's very unsatisfying if you find out why he did what he did and it was all this stuff that you have just not been privy to as the reader. So I had to feed that into the book, but in a way where the reader wouldn't spot it.
That's one of the things that I do love about your books is that you get to the end and it all makes sense, but I sit here thinking, how did I not see that coming? So it isn't a big dump. It isn't like, where did this come from? It all makes perfect sense, but because you have woven it through the story, but I rarely figure anything out, which I just love.
That is what I seek to do always. It is the biggest headache I have in my writing process, and it's the biggest thing that I consistently think, which is how can I kind of put all of the cards down in front of the reader? You know, nobody likes a book where you've effectively got a full house and you put them all down at the end, but not have the reader piece it together. And it's quite an intellectual task for me. And I so often, with every book, I think I have a document which is what is the ending, and then I have a document which is what do I want the reader to think the ending is, because I like them to feel that they're getting information but they might be going down the wrong path. And that is the biggest thing I whinge about all year when writing my novels, is how to do that. So I'm very glad you like it.
I definitely do, because that's hard to find sometimes. So that's one of the reasons I think that your books always really appeal to me.
Oh, thank you. I think it's I regularly read thrillers where it kind of goes a bit mad at the end, and I always seek to not do that, but it is a weird impulse that thriller books seem to want to go a bit crazy at the end, almost like they've got a mind of their own.
And I think lately that's even a bigger trend. Like you just get to the end and like the last 10%, 50 things are unveiled. And I'm like, whoa, like I can just hardly keep up here. Sometimes it's fun and it's over the top and I don't mind it. But often I'm like, okay, there's a lot happening in this last 10%.
Yeah, and I think I'm not actually a particularly attentive reader, because so often at the end of a thriller, I'm like, oh, that person did it, but wait, who is that? Like, I just think I'm not actually very good at reading in that respect. So I try and make it very simple for my readers, probably because of my own attention span.
I get that. Was it unsettling as you were writing this book to inhabit Camilla and think about what it would be like if your husband was a hostage taker? I mean, did that mess with you at all? Or are you able to just leave it where it is on the page?
Weirdly, it didn't. And I sort of think it's because it's a bit like being on a movie set where you know the blood's fake. Do you know what I mean? You can see the cameras rolling. And actually, I think I aim to unsettle readers, but very rarely am I unsettled myself. But what I would say is that some novels I end up emotionally spent. I just delivered a book that I feel extracted part of my soul in the writing, and I actually felt quite burnt out for a month or two after delivering it. And I think it was because it was kind of extra personal, and I don't know, it was very like emotionally involved novel. And I do think they definitely unsettle me in that way, in that sometimes I feel like they've taken something from me.
Does that happen each time, or is it just certain books?
It is just certain books, actually. I don't know why. I think sometimes it's when it is about a parent and child that it takes something from me. And I think that's because it's so visceral, that relationship, and sort of so directly relevant to me at the moment with quite a young child. The emotions are always quite high around that, I think.
I think that's exactly right. My kids are older now, but when they were young, I couldn't watch anything where children were kidnapped or horrible things happened to kids. I still don't really like those kind of stories, but I can at least do it now. I could not when they were young.
It's weird, isn't it? I don't know if it's hormonal or, I don't know, some sort of primal thing, but I'm the same. I find things extra upsetting that I didn't used to.
Definitely. Well, let's talk about the title and the cover. I love your US cover, and I looked up your UK cover, and it's really different. So let's talk about that cover process and how you came up with Famous Last Words as the title.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was sort of toying for a long time over. It's hard to title a book that's about hostages without it sounding quite Boysy. In the end, my good writer friend, Beth O'Leary, said to me, isn't it kind of about interpreting the note that he left, though? Because Camilla also has to look at a lot of things he left behind. Like most of us, Luke has a large digital footprint. And if you commit a crime, you know, if somebody's going through your phone afterwards, they will find all sorts of notes and emails and things left behind. You know, his Uber Eats receipts are in the book. And that actually got me onto kind of finding a sort of idiom that speaks to that last note left behind. But it took a really long time. This book, I think, had more titles than any of my other books. Every time I sent an edit back, it had a new title. And then we were kind of like, it's not quite right, until we landed on this one.
I think it really represents the book.
Thank you.
What about the covers?
They're different, aren't they? I find it really interesting. I naturally thought that it would be a note, but I think in the UK, that looked a little bit like non-fiction-y, because there is a little bit of a trend for like notebooks and stuff on non-fiction covers over here. So we have the X in the kind of steamed up mirror or window, and I love that kind of as an emblem. But yeah, I love the sort of the book as rustic note from the US edition is so cool, isn't it?
It definitely is. It's fascinating to me the difference in the thriller covers in the UK and the thriller covers here. They're just vastly different.
Yes, they really are. And, I can only speak to the British market. So I have a lot of thoughts on the British covers normally. But the American covers, I tend to think, I don't really kind of, I don't go to Barnes and Noble, etc. very regularly. So I don't really know kind of like what kind of genre you're speaking to and, what a thriller looks like in America, because they are so different to here, which I find so interesting because I find the readers very similar.
I agree completely. And the times I've been in London and walked through the bookstore or looked up covers like this one, it's really interesting to see how different the covers are because clearly they've gone in two very different directions, but I think the readers are similar.
Yes, it is funny. It is really funny. And I think in some ways it's about expectation of if covers have looked a certain way in either country for a long time, then you kind of go with that, don't you?
I think that's exactly right. There's been such a conversation here in the historical fiction market with these women looking away, the kind of the backside of a woman. And forever, marketers have said, well, that's what people understand, that it's going to be historical fiction when they see that. But I'm like, you've got to get away from it. And they're starting to now. But it is interesting. I think a trend starts and it goes sometimes for a very long time.
Yeah. And I think I sort of have a bit of a bee in my bonnet about, I don't know if that's a phrase you have in America, but I sort of mean I talk endlessly about standing out and fitting in. And I think the ideal is a combination of the two, where you're recognizably a thriller, but people look at it and think that's not like all the others. And I'm intrigued by it and I want to pick it up.
I agree. And being in your bonnet is definitely an expression here. I am the exact same way. Like, please stop with all these covers that I could put 7 books beside and you would have a hard time distinguishing them versus something, as you said, signals still thriller, but doesn't look like every other book. And I think that's why I really just loved your cover, because it is different, but in a good way.
Oh, thank you. And I think so much is the same in the writing. A hostage situation is a recognizable element, but I wanted to do something new with it. And I think that the same but different is something that sort of is true across the board, really, whether in covers or writing or titles.
I agree. And you said something that I hadn't really thought about with your books. I've always thought about subverting the tropes, which is one of the things I really enjoy, but also making it more female-centric. And you do, and I obviously understand that now that you're saying it, but I'm not sure I'd focused on it. And I love that.
Thank you. I think it's interesting, isn't it? My next book is about a ransom, and a ransom is kind of an almost old-fashioned and typically sort of male kind of thing to receive. You would imagine it would be a movie like Taken, with Liam Neeson and guns. But I thought, what if you receive a ransom as a mother? And what if it tells you to do something that is worse than paying money? And that's kind of where the idea for my next came from.
And when is that one coming out?
I think it's February 2026. So a year after Famous Last Words. It's the main edits are done, I think. Who knows? Famous Last Words, etc. But hopefully they're done and we'll be on to line edits soon. So yeah, it's shaping up.
Okay, good. I'll keep an eye out for that.
Thank you.
Well, Gillian, before we wrap up, what have you read recently that you really liked?
I am forever recommending Nightwatching by Tracy Sierra. I think it's so fantastic. It's about a woman. It's a very simple premise. A woman is home with her 2 young children and she hears a footstep on the stairs. But ingeniously, Sierra plays out the whole novel virtually closed set while this man looks for her and her 2 children, and they're hiding in the house together. And the premise sounds almost horror, but it's absolutely not. It's a rumination on motherhood and protecting your child. And kind of the moment she realizes that this intruder is someone they know is such a interesting early moment in the plot that changes everything.
Okay, I would never sleep again. I'm familiar with that book, and I think maybe it's being made into a TV show or a movie. I feel like I read that somewhere lately, but I would never. I already worry about that, and when I'm the only one in the house, I have 2 big golden retrievers, so
Do you? I have a golden retriever too.
too. Oh, I love golden retrievers.
I
They're
love it because do yours guard? Because mine does. And if I ever hear something, I think, well, there's not someone in the house because she'd bark.
Exactly. And my dogs bark when people walk by, even like an old lady or a person with their baby in a stroller. But I feel like it's great protection because they sound so fierce that no one's going to get anywhere near the house. But still, when I hear noises.
Actually, if somebody got in, my dog would be like, give me a belly rub. She wouldn't like protect us at all.
I was just telling my husband that over the weekend, that if they actually got in the house, both of my dogs would be like, oh, please pet me.
Yeah, I know. They'd be like, hi, welcome. But yeah, the ferocious barking is pretty handy.
It really is. Yes. Take what you want as long as you pet me.
Exactly.
Well, as always, it is delightful to chat with you, and I can't wait for Famous Last Words to make its way out into the world.
Thanks so much for having me.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hi, I'm Emma.
And I'm Joe.
And we're the Professional Book Nerds. 2 Mondays a month, we interview authors and talk about their upcoming books, what drives them, and their go-to order at the cafe.
On Thursdays, we share recommendations and dive into topics readers face, like how do I actually read the books on my to-be-read list?
You can find the Professional Book Nerds podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Want to learn more about us? Our website is professionalbooknerds.com, and you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at ProBookNerds.
We hope you'll come and listen, and as always,
Happy reading!
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. I would love to connect with you on Instagram or Facebook, where you can find me at Thoughts from a Page. If you enjoy the show and have a moment to rate it or subscribe to it wherever you listen to your podcasts, I would really appreciate it. It makes a huge difference. And please tell all of your friends about Thoughts from a Page. Word of mouth does wonders to help the show grow. The book discussed in this episode can be purchased at my bookshop storefront, and the link is in the show notes. I hope you'll tune in next time.
Are you tired of seeing your teen or young adult struggle on a path that clearly isn't the right fit? Is your teenager confused about which direction to take after high school? The future of work is changing rapidly, and our kids need to know all of the options available after high school so they're empowered to make the choice that is best for them. In each episode, we explore the latest trends that are shaping the opportunities of today and tomorrow. I'm your host, Betsy Jewell, and this is the High School Hamster Wheel Podcast.
Don't you know that you're a grown-up?
I'm a grown-up.
Me too.
Yep, me too. But these days being a grown-up can really suck.
Luckily, we're grown-ups who grew up in the coolest generation.
We had video arcades.
And also some of the best TV and movies ever made.
We lived the origin of awesome consumer electronics. The list goes on and on.
Yep, Generation X.
Exactly.
And we're Gen X grown-up.
Every week, the Gen X Grown Up podcast explores media, tech, toys, games, and more from both yesterday and today.
Through the eyes of Generation Xers who absolutely love that stuff. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
Or find us on our website, genxgrownup.com. All right, you think that was good enough?
I
hope so, man. I'm tired.
Who listens to a promo on a podcast and then goes and listens to a different podcast?
Right.
I've never done it.
No.
Right.